Android outdoes Apple in smartphone sales in Australia, and one of the biggest hurricanes ever to hit Florida is due to make landfall tonight. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It is Wednesday, the 9th of October, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, the main story this morning, a bit of good news, really. Finally, the consumer mood is starting to pick up, with sentiment now at its highest level since the Reserve Bank started cutting rates in May 2022.
The Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Index rose 6% over the past month to 89.8 points. And while any reading below 100 is still negative, Michael, it's much better than any reading any time recently. Slowing inflation, prospects of no more rate hikes, coupled with plenty of government spending and a resilient labour market have all helped push consumer confidence higher. The Stage 3 tax cuts undoubtedly would have helped as well. Consumers are more positive about the future. But family finances versus a year ago is deeply negative, coming in at 73.8 points compared to the long-run average of 83 points. The other data point economists like to look at is now a good time to buy a household item. Well, that reading sits at 85.1 points. The historical average is 124 points. That ain't so good. The good time to buy a dwelling reading was higher, though it's still negative. Consumers really have been a miserable bunch for the past couple of years. While we can't quite say they're happy, they are certainly a bit less grumpy. And in fact, we might even have to say they're happier, and that is good for the economy.
But they're still negative, really, though, aren't they?
They are, but the trend is your friend, Michael. We always talk about that. And finally, we seem to be getting over our Malay. Is that the word?
Yeah.
You know, we're all grumpy, Malay, and just starting to be a bit more positive about the next 6-12 months.
We've turned a positivity corner, Sean.
That's it.
And business confidence is also improving.
Yeah, so both conditions and confidence have ticked up according to the National Australia Bank business surveys. However, the trend line on that one is still down. Now, business conditions in particular, and I suppose to a lesser extent confidence, have been in positive territory for most of the past decade, except in the COVID period. That seems to be changing, with leading indicators such as forward orders softening. The price measures are always worth looking at. Big one for Stephen Koukoulas, loves these. They show that while input price growth for companies remain a bit elevated, output price growth is back to more normal levels, i.e., it suggests inflation is definitely slowing, and that is a good thing.
Just on the consumer sentiment, I love that we say that they, consumers, forgetting that we are, in fact, consumers ourselves. So we kind of need to group ourselves in with the miserable bunch here, don't we, Sean?
Yeah, well, some are more miserable than others, Michael. Let's put it that way.
Feels very much targeted.
A little pointed.
Somewhat personal. Let's move on to local markets, shall we? What happened yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 finished down 0.35% to 8,177 points. The mining stocks led the way lower on a falling iron ore price. Fortescue Metals Group was the worst performer of the ASX 200, dropping more than 5%. BHP was down nearly 2.5%. Woodside dropped more than 1%. Other poor performers included QBE and Telstra. CSL was among the best performers, jumping 1.3%, while all the big banks were higher. Lithium stocks continued to rally on the back of Rio Tinto's proposed bid for Arcadium, which will be as much as $9 billion. West African Resources jumped 7%, recouping some of Monday's 18% slump amid concerns about the future of its mining permits in Burkina Faso. The company came out yesterday and said it had received confirmation from the country's Ministry of Mines and Quarries that none of its mining permits were under review. It was the best performer of the top 200 yesterday.
Now, Sean, you've got a great interview coming up after the show, and I found this one fascinating. You're talking with Duško Bajic, who is the head of Australian equities growth at First Sentier Investors.
Bit of a guru on tech stocks is Duško. And so we ask him what he thinks of WiseTech Global, which is the market leader, but we go into quite a bit of detail. Now, the argument with WiseTech is that it's too expensive, good growth prospects, but too expensive. So we asked Duško what he thinks about that, and he gives the pluses and minuses of that. We also talk about Pro Medicus, the medical imaging company, the cloud accounting company Xero, what he looks for in tech stocks. It's a fantastic chat.
Yeah, it really is. So stick around for that one. It's coming up after the show. What's happening in international markets, Sean?
Well, Michael, there were very high expectations for more big announcements from Beijing to help stimulate the world's second largest economy. For hours beforehand, the media was waiting. Something big was going to happen.
Bated breath, would you say?
Bated breath,
Ooh.
collective bated breaths. They turned up. The Chinese officials turned up. No, nothing happened. Basically, no real stimulus forthcoming. There was a very, very minor announcement, but you could just sort of feel the disappointment, and it triggered a sell-off in iron ore prices, pulling down the local mining stocks, as we mentioned. We also had the World Bank coming out and saying it expects China's growth to deteriorate next year, despite its recent stimulus measures, weighing on growth prospects for neighbouring countries such as Australia. The World Bank reckons that China will expand by 4.8% this year, which is actually a little lower than the 5% forecast from Beijing. The World Bank reckons it'll be 4.3% next year. Now, the Chinese share market jumped on reopening after that week-long public holiday, and then there was no major announcement, so then it sort of slumped again. Otherwise, oil prices, having run for 5 days straight, have come off, with Brent back below $80 a barrel. Gold's fallen as traders paired expectations of interest rate cuts in the US, and the Aussie dollar's trading under 68 US cents.
Can you imagine being the official sent out to deliver a less than exciting stimulus announcement when everyone is there waiting, really excited, expecting something huge? It's like, sorry, oh God, they've sent out Darren. No, this isn't going to be so good, is it? He always gets the bad news.
Poor old Darren.
Yeah. Anyway.
Wait, is Darren like the equivalent to Karen?
I'm assuming so. And
I know some Darrens and I really like them, so I'm feeling bad about that, but I'm going with it. Darren and Karen.
It's the first name that came into my head. I'm sorry. I apologise to any Darrens who are offended by the comparison to Karens. Anyway, gosh, we're going off on some tangents, don't we? Let's get back on track. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says 1,215 Australians, permanent residents and their immediate family members have been assisted by the government to leave Lebanon.
There were 2 flights out of the area on Saturday, 2 on Sunday, 2 on Monday. There are another 3,892 Australians and their immediate family members registered to depart, with 2 flights scheduled to leave Beirut overnight. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has condemned Hamas terror attacks on Israel and called for an immediate ceasefire and the release of the remaining hostages in a motion in the House of Representatives. The motion condemned the murder and violence of the attacks on October 7 last year, when 1,200 innocent Israelis lost their lives. Mr Albanese said Parliament stood against all forms of anti-Semitism, but the opposition didn't support the motion that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese put forward. Opposition leader Peter Dutton said the Prime Minister was seeking to walk both sides of the street in the divisive debate surrounding tensions in the Middle East.
And Sean, a somewhat riled Prime Minister was forced to apologise in Parliament yesterday after he accused Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor of having Tourette syndrome.
Mr Albanese was asked if he would rule out any changes to the tax treatment of the owner-occupied family home and to negative gearing by Mr Taylor in question time. Now, there are plenty of immediate interjections from the outset, and the Prime Minister blamed the opposition for blocking Labor's housing policy. He went on to say, and I quote, "This nonsense that they carry on with, have you got Tourette's or something? You know, you just sit there, babble, babble, babble." Mr Albanese then withdrew his comment and apologised. Earlier, Treasurer Jim Chalmers said Labor would not knock off the current tax breaks in any new housing policy. Just before we leave Canberra, an interested observer yesterday was former British Prime Minister Liz Truss, who attended question time as a guest of opposition leader Peter Dutton.
It's an odd guest to have in Parliament. It makes sense. But
Conservative British Prime Minister, 50 days, I think she lasted, Liz Truss.
Yeah, 49. She was outlasted, of course, remember, by that lettuce. And I mention this because yesterday there was a plaque erected outside the Tesco supermarket where the lettuce was purchased.
Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It's a blue plaque. You know what? I'm going to put a link to this plaque and that story and the original video in the Fear and Greed newsletter.
Ah, Great idea.
which comes out this morning. So if you haven't already signed up, head along to fearandgreed.com.au. And there's a lot more stuff than just a link to a lettuce plaque.
There is.
So head along to the website, fearandgreed.com.au, and sign up for the newsletter. It'll come out in a few hours, so you better jump on that right now. Sean, all options remain on the table for the Reserve Bank in terms of interest rate deliberations, according to the board minutes released yesterday.
And that means another interest rate hike is still a live option. The Reserve Bank board minutes for its September meeting said there is still considerable uncertainty over the economy's outlook, and future financial conditions might need to be either tighter or looser than at present to achieve the board's objectives. If household consumption picks up strongly due to the Stage 3 tax cuts or the strong jobs market, the economy's supply constraints might be greater than anticipated, and interest rates may need to remain higher for longer or, and I quote, tighten further. The minutes also say, though, that monetary policy may have to be loosened if the economy proves to be weaker than expected, causing a sharp reduction in inflation. Meanwhile, Deputy Governor Andrew Hauser was speaking yesterday. He said the central bank was determined to bring down inflation and that he genuinely doesn't know what the next move in interest rates is.
Sean, I mentioned this next one at the top of the show. Nearly 4 million smartphones were sold in the first half of 2024 in Australia, up 8% from a year ago.
Of those sales, Android phones accounted for 56%, while Apple took out the remaining 44%, according to smartphone analyst Telsight. Telsight expects total smartphone sales to reach 8.7 billion units for the full year, which would be up 7% on last year. Now, Michael, I thought that was an extraordinarily large number.
How many did you say? 8.7 million?
Yeah, there are 26 million Australians. So that suggests 1 in 3 Aussies, man, woman and child, gets a new phone every year.
What?
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously some people that have multiple phones.
Well, I think
drug dealers.
Yeah. That didn't come to mind, but yeah. I mean, Telsight did say that customers are actually beginning to hang on to their smartphones for longer. So in the sub $1,000 market, the average life cycle is now 4 years. Premium smartphone users replace their devices every 3 years. So I think that all means that people now increasingly are holding more than one smartphone device. And I'm not just talking about the drug users. I'm talking about everyday people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think that's quite incredible, really.
Well, and Sean, it's actually a perfect opportunity to mention, you know how every Wednesday we have our sister podcast, How Do They Afford That?
Yeah.
Comes out. And just bear with me, the link sounds tenuous at the moment, but it is a very, very clear and very direct link. Today's episode is all about affordable technology, and we're joined in the studio by Stephen Fennick from techguide.com.au, and he's joined us on Fear and Greed many times. But for today's episode of How Do They Afford That, we are talking about affordable technology and really diving into the world of smartphones, going, you don't need to spend $1,800 to buy a premium phone. Now that you can get things for $200, $300, up to $500 that have got all of the big technological developments of the last few years in terms of kind of your Face ID and your multi-lens cameras and things. And Stephen goes through all of them and gives you a bunch of different brands and things to look at.
Did you explain why more Androids were sold than Apples?
Well, yes.
Oh.
Well, I mean, look, to be honest, this was recorded before this piece
the numbers
of
came
news
out. Yeah.
But Stephen does cover the fact that Samsung has a lot more options within its range. So that whereas kind of Apple has that premium product and a premium price, and it doesn't vary a huge amount from that, Samsung has a lot of different options, right, ranging from the premium right down to more budget kind of levels. And I think that would kind of cover that.
I think so. I think that some of the Android's AI stuff came in earlier than Apple. I mean, Apple's had a big announcement in recent weeks.
Yeah.
But in the first 6 months, Android was in front in that. So that probably helped as well.
Yeah, indeed. Anyway, definitely worth a listen, Sean. Now, international news time. Hurricane warnings have been issued for portions of west central Florida as Milton, a top-tier Category 5 hurricane over the Gulf of Mexico, continues to rapidly gain strength.
The storm is expected to make landfall late on Wednesday US time. That'll be really tomorrow morning our time. And it's been called an extremely life-threatening major hurricane. That's by the National Hurricane Center. The center said it could produce a potentially devastating ocean surge of over 3 meters in some areas, including flood-prone Tampa Bay, according to a report in the Washington Post. Milton has the potential to be one of the most destructive hurricanes on record in west central Florida. The center said the storm went from Category 1 to Category 5 in just 24 hours. Quite amazing how quickly it gained momentum. Peak winds are now more than 150 kilometres an hour. Milton is the strongest Gulf of Mexico hurricane on record for this late in the year and is among the 3 strongest at any time.
Now, Sean, Chinese authorities are demanding that a growing number of school teachers and other public sector employees hand in their passports.
Yeah, so the passport collection drive, carried out under what's known as personal travel abroad management, allows local government officials to control and monitor who can travel abroad, how often and to where, according to a report in the FT. It comes as President Xi Jinping steps up state involvement in everyday life and clamps down on official corruption. China's powerful state security apparatus has also intensified its campaign against foreign espionage. Restrictions on international travel have been greatly expanded from last year to include rank-and-file employees of schools, universities, local governments and state-owned groups. The passport collection appears to be based on national regulations from 2003 that established a system to restrict travel for key personnel, such as mid to high-level officials, and allowed local authorities to set rules for all state employees around international travel.
And finally, Sean, Apple has backtracked on plans to release major films in theatres and rather is pushing production back towards its streaming service.
Yeah, it's a real backflip for Apple. It comes after the disappointing box office performance of a bunch of big-budget Apple films. Killers of the Flower Moon was one, Napoleon, Argyle, Fly Me to the Moon. Apple cancelled plans to release Wolves, which is an action comedy starring George Clooney and Brad Pitt, which I watched and found little action and little comedy in. Anyway, Apple cancelled plans to release Wolves in thousands of theatres globally. Instead, the picture made its debut in a limited number of venues before it became available on Apple TV+, the streaming service, late last month. Now, according to Bloomberg, Apple plans to use a similar approach with the next few titles on its calendar, including the World War II drama Blitz. After spending upwards of $100 million, and in some cases more than $200 million on some of those films I just mentioned, Apple will now focus on making about a dozen movies a year, most of them produced for less than $100 million, according to the report, and they'll go straight to streaming.
How about your savage movie reviews?
Have you seen Wolves?
No.
It's got George Clooney. It's got Brad Pitt. It's supposed to be great. Oh, what a yawn.
I've seen 2 of the other ones that you mentioned, Argyle and Fly Me to the Moon. I enjoyed them both. Maybe I'm just a more generous soul than you.
So I saw Napoleon and I thought that was a bit of drudgery. And Killers of the Flower Moon could have been a great film. I saw that, but the focus was very much on the main stars. The story of the Indians in the US, if it was more about that, I would have loved that film, but it wasn't. It was really more about white settlement, and that was missed opportunity.
It was a miss for you. All right, maybe we should introduce a Sean's pick. And
what was Fly Me to the Moon about? I'm trying to remember that one.
So that is like the propaganda really behind the moon landing.
Ah, wow.
It was good fun. I just enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And Argyle was a great kind of action comedy. Anyway, seriously, you don't want my movie reviews. Everything is great. I loved it. Yeah. And yours are just negative. So somewhere in the middle is actually the truth.
Yeah.
All right, Sean, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Dushko Bajic, who is head of Australian equities growth at First Sentier Investors.
We focused on 3 stocks: WiseTech Global, Pro Medicus, Xero, pretty much the 3 big Australian tech stocks. And Dushko gives us a rundown of the good and the bad of each. Well worth a listen.
Yeah, it is a really good chat. It is coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Wednesday, the 9th of October, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.